would like to talk a little bit briefly, just to sort of set up what we're about to go see. Now, during the attack on Pearl Harbor, there were 21 ships that were sunk or damaged. And of those ships, 5 of them were battleships: the Nevada, the Arizona, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, and the California. And despite that, all but 2 of those ships were eventually raised out of the harbor, and all but 3 were returned into service. Those 3 being, of course, the Arizona, the Utah, and the Oklahoma. Now, hopefully you've all had a chance to go out to the Arizona Memorial today to pay your respects there. Not a lot of people have a chance to get out to the Utah and the Oklahoma memorials, being as they are on the military base. And this is a somewhat rare and unique opportunity, and I, for one, am very grateful to have the chance to take you out there. It's the USS Utah Memorial. But before that, I would like to talk to us a little bit and sort of set the stage for what happened on December 7th, 1941. And to do that, we have to go back to the previous evening, December 6th, 1941. Now, the first thing to note is that Pearl Harbor has not always been the home of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The base here was only first established in the 19-teens, really built up in the 1920s. And for most of the first 2 decades here, the base was really only used by the majority of the fleet during their annual training exercises. Otherwise, the ships would all be in their bases along the west coast, places like Bremerton, Long Beach. But in 1940, after their big annual training exercise took place out here, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered the fleet to stay here as what he hoped would be a deterrent to Japanese expansion in Southeast Asia. Now, of course, the base had not been built for having the whole Pacific Fleet out here. So they had to expand the base rapidly, building up all kinds of facilities, dry docks, fuel tanks, repair facilities, barracks, recreational facilities, all kinds of stuff for all of the sailors and Marines that were now stationed here. Now, the base was then, as this did, home of thousands of U.S. servicemen, as well as the workplace of countless civilian contractors and other personnel. Now, most of these sailors and Marines were young, and they came from all across the country, and not just places like, well, obviously the States, but they came from the territories, Hawaii and Alaska, which, remember, we're still territories back then. Also places like the Philippines, which at the time were still a U.S. colony. Some of the sailors that were here weren't originally from the U.S. at all. Peter Tomish, who was the chief water tender aboard the USS Utah, well, he had actually been born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1893. He had traveled to the U.S. as a young man, along with one of his relatives. They had gone off to join the Army during World War I, although they didn't see combat. But Tomish decided after the war to join the Navy, and he'd stayed there ever since. He didn't have family, no wife or kids that we know of. For him, well, the Navy was his family. But he was a little bit of the exception, as most of these sailors and Marines here were young men. Many of them were still teenagers. And on tonight, December 6th, a lot of them were enjoying a night out on the town in Honolulu. Now, some of them, of course, went out just to do what a lot of you guys do. Enjoy the exotic and tropical environment of Honolulu, buying exotic and tropical gifts to send home to their families back home. Because remember, this is just before Christmas. A lot of them are doing their annual Christmas shopping. A lot of them, of course, are enjoying the city's many bars and restaurants. And other places of less repute, we'll say. But, of course, not everybody's going downtown tonight. Some of them stay on base. A lot of them stay on their ships where they have the latest Hollywood movies projected on the rear deck. Some of them are gathered up at the brand new Block Recreational Arena for the ongoing Battle of Music. This is a bi-weekly competition where bands from all across the fleet are gathering up to compete in a grand tournament to see which band is the best in the fleet. Now, tonight, the bands have been from the battleships Pennsylvania and the Tennessee, as well as the auxiliary ship, the Argonne, and the band from the submarine base. Now, they would compete with, a swing number, a ballad, and a specialty tune, and finally they performed a jitterbug contest. Now, tonight, the winner had been from the battleship Pennsylvania, and in 2 weeks' time, they were scheduled to go up against, among others, Band Unit 22 from the battleship Arizona. Now, One of the sailors that was coming home that night was named Jack Vasson from Sonoma, California. At about 25 years old, he was a little bit older than the average sailor here, but he was otherwise pretty typical. Now, he had gone downtown along with one of his buddies to get his mom a Christmas card. Well, his buddy got himself a brand new tattoo. Now, the thing was that they had to make sure to be back to their ship by the end of their curfew, which in their case was midnight. And it wasn't enough just to be back to the base, which would take about an hour on the bus to get all the way back here. Oh, no. They had to get back to their base and then jump on a small boat that would take them all the way across the harbor to be dropped off at their ship, the USS Utah. Now, other sailors that were a little bit luckier, they could get to the base and there were tenders for each of the great battleships that were in Battleship Row. And if you were standing there in the dock, you'd hear the coxswains calling out the names of those great ships. The Maryland, Tennessee, West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona, Nevada, California. Get on the boat. Last call. Now, not everyone had been lucky enough to get liberty that evening. Some of the men, like Stephen Young, who was aboard the USS Oklahoma, well, he was awaiting tomorrow for his chance of liberty. And he was excited because he had a hot date planned over at Nanakuli Beach on the west side of Oahu. Other sailors on the Oklahoma, like Paul Goodyear and Ensign John England, were awaiting just a nice, easy day of light duty. Now, Paul Goodyear, he was from Michigan, like myself, and he had never seen the ocean before he had actually signed up with the Navy. John England, he was from Oklahoma, and as a kid, he had actually dreamed of serving on that great battleship that shared his state's name. Now, John England was the youngest officer on board the Oklahoma, only 4 days away from his 21st birthday. And he was especially excited because in just a few weeks' time, his wife and his 1-month-old daughter were going to be coming out to visit him. And you cannot imagine how excited he was. He sent letters back home telling his family how jealous he was that everybody else had gotten to meet her before he did. But, in just a couple weeks' time, he'd be getting his chance. But as the sun fell down, all the sailors went into their bunks and prepared for the next day. Nobody could have known or possibly expected just what was about to happen. I mean, tensions with Japan were high, but and war was likely. But an attack on Pearl Harbor, for a lot of these sailors, that would have seemed a joke. I mean, Pearl Harbor was just so far away, so well defended, it had become known as Fortress Oahu, covered in fortifications and airfields. The whole Pacific Fleet was here. So, if war was going to happen, it would break out in the Philippines or somewhere else, but not here, not now. But even though these sailors weren't anticipating an attack, that's not to say that they weren't unprepared, or at least not entirely. Since joining the Navy, each of these men had worked hard. They'd been training constantly. They understood their roles in combat. They understood their ships. And when the time came, they would do anything to help protect these ships, to help protect those fellow sailors. Because those sailors, they were their families, and these ships were their homes. Like I said, they would do anything to help defend them. Now at this point, we're going to walk down onto the grass. We're going to take a look at the Utah, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. Sound good? Across there, those are actually not Navy. Those were the Super Ferry, a brief attempt to have a ferry between a high-speed ferry, car ferry actually, between Oahu and Maui. Fortunately, it only operated for a few months back in 2008, which is very annoying because I would love to take use of it. So, here though, we stand at what remains of the USS Utah. Hull number AG-16, formerly BB-31. Now, before we talk about how she got here, let's talk a little bit about what exactly it is we're looking at. Now, on the morning of December 7th, the Utah was hit by 2 torpedoes, capsized and sank. Navy tried to bring her back up, failed, left her where she was. You can see the steel cables draped across her from that initial attempt to try and raise her back up. Now, today she sits at about a 31-degree angle facing away from us. I actually have a picture here showing what she looks like under the surface. That hopefully should give us a little bit of perspective. And that white buoy out there marks the stern or the rear of the Utah. And there's another white buoy on the other side of this memorial platform here that marks the bow. If you're looking at here, basically, so that's the bow, that's the stern, and this bit right here is the bit that's sticking up above the water. So, does that all make sense? I can only certainly hope so. All right. And if you need another look at it, just let me know. But now that we've talked about how she got here, what she looks like, let's talk about how she got here. Now, the Utah was commissioned in August of 1911 as a brand new Florida-class dreadnought battleship. She was a pretty good-looking ship back in the day, if I do say so myself. She, when launched, had 10 powerful 12-inch guns that were capable of firing an 870 pound distance. She could travel at speeds of up to 20 knots. She had thick armor plating. She was the pinnacle of American naval technology. But she didn't stay on that pinnacle for very long. The Utah was what was called a dreadnought battleship. It was a new type of ship that had been developed just a few years prior to the launch of the British HMS Dreadnought in 1906. It made every other nation's battleships obsolete, which meant that now the world was locked in a great naval arms race to try and build up as many new dreadnought-type battleships as they could. Every nation that could afford to, and many that couldn't, were building as many of these ships as they could, and they were building bigger and more powerful versions of the dreadnought. And between the time of the Utah being commissioned in 1911 and the U.S. going to war in 1917, the U.S. Navy would get themselves 8 brand new dreadnought battleships, each one of which was bigger and more powerful than the old Utah. But even though she didn't stay on that pinnacle of naval technology for very long, she still had a pretty respectable career for a warship. She assisted with the invasion of Veracruz during the Mexican Civil War in 1914. She escorted convoys across the Atlantic during World War I, escorted Woodrow Wilson to Versailles, and after the war, the Navy kept her in service. They actually upgraded her old coal-fired boilers to brand new oil burners. She visited countries in South America as part of the Goodwill Tour. Then, the end came for the Utah with the stroke of the pen, the signing of the London Naval Treaty in 1930. You see, there was that huge naval arms race before World War I, and there were a lot of people that thought maybe, well, that's the reason why everyone went to war in the first place, or at least one of the reasons. And it was very expensive. So, a lot of countries decided to try and prevent a new naval arms race by signing treaties that would dictate how many ships each country could have and how big these ships could be. She went into the dry dock. Her guns were removed, as were much of her armor plating. But then, they put in a brand new system that would enable another ship to remotely control her direction and heading, and her speed as well, even the boiler pressure. This enabled this other ship to turn her into basically what was the peak of 1930s technology, effectively a drone. So, she came out of the dry docks in 1932 as the brand new AG-16, and she set to work with a new training schedule as the Navy sought to try and use her for 2 important types of training: dive bomber training and gunnery practice. Gunnery practice is simple. So you towed along a target barge, and all the battleships and cruisers would all take turns shooting at that barge to try and practice their gunnery. Dive bomber training was what that remote control system came in handy for, because the Navy knew that the art of dropping bombs was a very new science, and they needed as much practice at it as they could get. So, planes would fly over the Utah. Now, she would be sailing out with a huge number of big, thick railroad ties on her deck. I actually have a picture of her sailing along with those big, thick timbers. Each of these is probably about 22 feet long and about a foot thick. So, pretty thick pieces of wood. Now, when the time came for the drill to begin, the crew would go down below, and then the planes would fly up onto the Utah as another ship took control of her. And while they would be trying to weave her back and forth and try and throw the pilots off their aim, the pilots would come down, drop their bombs onto the Utah. And the bombs, these were just practice bombs filled with colored powder, so that when they hit the deck, they would explode in a shower of colored smoke, which would enable the pilots to tell who got the hits and where they hit. And this was pretty valuable training. And afterwards, many of the U.S. dive bomber pilots gave a lot of credit to their skill from the training they'd gotten from dropping their bombs on the Utah. Now, for the crew down below, it was pretty boring stuff. Sitting down below the deck, listening to the roar of guns in the distance, or the thump of practice bombs landing overhead. Hopefully, because the reason those railroad ties were there on top of the deck was because the deck itself wasn't actually thick enough to stop those bombs from dropping through. So, if one of them hit a gap in between those timbers, you could actually go through the deck and explode, which would be a very rude surprise for everybody inside. But the Utah was also used for anti-aircraft gunnery training. During the late 1930s, the U.S. knew that they needed a lot more anti-aircraft training, so they put on every type of anti-aircraft gun that was used by the Navy at the time. And then they would sail her out, and the trainees would take turns, practicing with all the different types of anti-aircraft guns. So the dive bomber practice, the gunnery training, anti-aircraft practice, this would all prove vital in the war years ahead. And the Utah helped significantly as the U.S. Navy was training in the years before the war. But on the day of December 7th, 1941, the Utah was, like the rest of the fleet, here, enjoying a nice brief respite from her grueling training schedule. Now, I'd like you to imagine for a second you're standing on the deck of the Utah. It is a beautiful morning here on December 7th. It's about 71 degrees, there's a light breeze, patchy clouds overhead, just a gorgeous day here on Oahu. And many of the sailors are looking to take advantage of that. They're lining up, gathering to prepare to go out on the Liberty boat that'll take them to shore so they can enjoy their day off. Well, the rest of the crew waits on board the ship and just goes about their day's duties. One of those men is Jack Vasson. His job is pretty simple. He's going to go down below the decks and he's going to replace all the batteries and the flashlights and the radios. Not exactly glamorous work, but well, someone's got to do it. And he goes down below to start his watch at about 15 minutes before 8 o'clock. At 8 o'clock, the national anthem's going to play, the flag's going to be raised, everyone salutes, and then they go about their day's duties. Now, if you're standing on the deck of the Utah, it's about 5 minutes before the national anthem's going to be played. You see planes flying overhead. And you probably don't think too much of it. Planes are flying overhead all the time. There's an airfield here on Port Island itself. There's an airfield over at Hickam, actually now part of the international airport they all flew into. There's an airfield over at Wheeler, the airfield out there. There's a couple different airfields along the southern part of the island. Suffice it to say, it's not exactly a rare sight to see a plane flying overhead. Then, you see fire and smoke rising from the south side of Port Island towards the seaplane base here. And your first thought is probably that, man, somebody must have screwed up. Must have been some kind of training accident, or maybe a plane crashed on takeoff. I mean, it's tragic, but things happen. Then, you see another plane flying overhead. You see the big red round insignia on the wing. And it's only then that you realize that that wasn't an accident. You're under attack. But at that moment, it's already too late. Because you can turn around and you can see planes flying over the water, just coming right towards you. They're flying low and they're flying slow. But they're low and slow enough for you to see the big, heavy torpedoes that are mounted underneath them. Now, what you cannot possibly know is that in one of history's great ironies, those pilots have been given explicit orders not to attack your ship. See, the Japanese Navy knows about the Utah. They know she's a training ship. They're here to sink aircraft carriers and battleships. Now, the battleships are on the other side of this island, what's called Battleship Row. This is called Carrier Row. This is normally where some of the big aircraft carriers would be tied up when they're here at port. There's 3 carriers that are attached to the Pacific Fleet that day. The Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga. And all 3 of those aircraft carriers are huge ships, and you would never be able to mistake any of them for the Utah. But the thing is, those aircraft carriers aren't here. The Enterprise, she's supposed to be here. She was delayed by heavy seas coming back from delivering aircraft to Wake Island. So, she's going to be a few hours late. She barely misses the attack. The Lexington, she left 2 days ago, delivering aircraft to Midway Atoll. She's also going to be missing the attack. And the Saratoga, she's over on the west coast. She's actually just about to head to San Diego. Which means that as those Japanese pilots are flying across the water, they've been told that if there's any aircraft carriers, they're going to be here. And those gray smudges, the against Ford Island as they're flying into that early morning haze with the sun rising in their eyes. 6 of them decide to take the risk. Their torpedoes hit the water, 2 each aimed at 3 different ships: Detroit, Raleigh, and the Utah. The Detroit is an older Omaha-class cruiser built during World War I. Fortunately for her, both of those torpedoes miss. Raleigh, she's also an Omaha-class cruiser. She's a little bit less lucky. One of those torpedoes hits against the side of the ship and explodes in a massive column of water and smoke rising up into the air, hundreds of feet above the deck. And then, you are helpless to do anything but watch. The first of 2 torpedoes slams into the side of your ship. Now, like I said, at that moment, Jack Vasson was down below the deck. He didn't see any Japanese planes come in, so he feels the impact of that torpedo, and he has no idea what's going on. His first thought is probably there was some kind of collision. Another ship accidentally hit into the Utah. But he feels a ship start to tilt. He hears the alarm sound for general orders, and he races down to where he knows he has to be, which is the ship's electrical control panel. Because he's been trained that if anything happens, that he needs to make sure the most important system to keep on is the ship's lights. Because you can't fight, you can't evacuate if you can't see where you're going. So he races down through the ship to try and get to that control panel. In another part of the ship, Peter Tomish, he's in the boiler, and he's in the boiler room, and he feels the ship tilt. He sees the water rushing in, and he knows that they do not have any chance. So he sends the rest of the men in the boiler room to evacuate. Get out of here. But he stays behind because he knows that if the cold water of Pearl Harbor crashes into the hot boilers of the Utah, it could create a steam explosion that could blow the ship apart before anybody has a chance to get out. But he's not going to let that happen. Instead, he stays behind, going to each of the boilers, letting off steam, cooling them off, even as the ship tilts more and more. Up on the deck of the ship, as the Utah is sinking, she is straining against the ropes holding her to her mooring key. I actually have a picture right here showing her. Now, some of the men, as it becomes clear that there's no saving this ship, the officers decide they have to abandon ship. Some of the men try and swim through the water out here to Ford Island. Now, if you're looking at where the Utah is right now, and where you're looking at where we are right now, you might think to yourself, well, that's pretty fortunate, it was so close. And it looks like that now. But you have to remember that things were a little bit different back in 1941. For starters, Utah, she was a little bit further out. She was dragged back in when they tried to roll her back over. The shoreline here was also a lot closer in, actually back out there by the road. And then, the other thing as well was that the water wasn't just this nice calm water right here. There was oil spewing out of the ruptured tanks of the Utah, forming a thick, sticky layer that in some places was up to a foot thick, almost impossible to swim through. As the Utah is straining against the ropes, eventually they snap, and the ship rolls over completely. And down below, Jack Vasson, who just got into that control panel, described it as seeing fire extinguishers and deck plates and everything you can imagine come crashing from the floor to the ceiling. And he barely manages to hold on. Up on the deck, many of the sailors see those big, thick, heavy timbers. They've been stacked up. They were actually going to take them off the ship the next day. Well, they come crashing down into the water. Some of the men, it's salvation. They can climb up onto them and hold on until they can be rescued. Other men are crushed as those timbers fall down on top of them. Now, Jack Vasson, once he gets his bearings, he gets to that control panel, and he follows his orders to take out all the different systems that he can. The ventilation, the cranes, everything, just to try and keep those lights on for a little bit longer. But it's only good for a few minutes. As the water rushes in, it crashes into the batteries and blows them out. And the entire ship is plunged into darkness. But Jack Vasson, his job that morning had been to replace the batteries in the flashlights and the radios. And he'd have the presence of mind to keep one of those flashlights with him. So, as the water's rushing in, he knows that his only chance is to try and go up into what had been the bottom of the Utah. So he races up, using that flashlight to guide his way, until he gets up to an air pocket in the now exposed bottom, or the keel, of the ship. Now, he also has a wrench with him, and he begins tapping it against the side of the ship. He knows that his only chance is if somebody hears him to get him out of there. So he just keeps tapping and tapping and tapping. He taps for 3 hours. He gets blisters on his fingers, but he just keeps tapping and tapping until finally he hears voices on the other side of the keel. He can't make out what they're saying, but it doesn't take long for him to see a red spot against the hull. He is showered in sparks as they begin cutting him out. And eventually they cut out a 16-inch wide oval. And when that plate comes crashing down, he does not hesitate for a second. He leaps out of the ship into a completely different world than the one he had left just a few hours ago. Pearl Harbor is now a war zone. The Raleigh is barely holding on, thanks to heroic efforts to her crew. The Utah is completely flipped over, and there are thick, towering columns of fire and smoke rising up into the sky. Now, Jack Vasson, he never actually did see any Japanese planes. He had gone down below, and he had left the Utah before and after the Japanese planes had been here. But he would be the only man cut out from the training ship Utah. But thanks to the efforts of many of the crewmen, even though the Utah sank rapidly, out of a crew of over 500 men, about a tenth of them were killed. So many men were able to escape, many more than perhaps there would have been otherwise. Now, at this time, you can go back up onto the platform, you can take a look at the Utah, I can answer any questions you have, then we're going to jump onto the bus and head over to the USS Oklahoma Memorial. Sound good? All right.